The Jeffrey Dahmer name drop hit the courtroom like a freight train, and the silence that followed was absolutely deafening. Justin Baldoni's legal team didn't just defend their client, they went nuclear with a comparison that left the entire room in a state of absolute shock. They weren't calling Blake Lively a monster, but they were making a point so cold and calculated that it shifted the entire energy of the legal battle. In a move that felt like a direct explosion of frustration, they argued that you simply cannot damage a reputation that was already tarnished long before the cameras even started rolling. This wasn't just a defense, it was a tactical strike meant to dismantle a movie star's image. Blake Lively is currently fighting a massive legal battle over her public image, claiming her reputation was destroyed by a coordinated campaign to paint her as a mean girl. But Baldoni isn't playing nice anymore. His lawyers dropped a series of filings that were precise, brutal, and completely devoid of the usual Hollywood fluff. They are essentially telling the court that the public's negative perception of Lively wasn't created by Baldoni's team, it was already there, buried under years of rumors and set-side whispers. The tension between the two stars has finally reached a boiling point where legal filings are being used as weapons to expose the cracks in a carefully curated persona. The strategy from Baldoni's side is a masterclass in legal aggression, moving far beyond typical courtroom pleasantries. They are digging into the idea that if a person already has a reputation for being difficult or a bully, then calling them a mean girl doesn't actually count as defamation. To prove this, they use the most extreme example possible, referencing the infamous Jeffrey Dahmer to show that you can't ruin the reputation of someone who is already known for their actions. It was a shocking moment that sent ripples through the media, but the legal logic was sound. They are forcing the court to look at Lively's past through a lens that her PR team has spent years trying to polish. Meanwhile, Lively's legal team is doing everything in their power to scrub her history clean. They are desperately attempting to exclude older articles and past reports that portray her in a negative light, arguing that her history on Gossip Girl or other sets is completely irrelevant to the current case. But Baldoni's side is pushing back with equal force, insisting that her background is the entire point. They argue that you can't claim someone gave you a bad reputation if you were already walking into the room with one. This tug-of-war over her past is turning the courtroom into a retrospective of every controversial moment in her career, and the stakes couldn't be higher. The situation took a dramatic turn during Lively's deposition, where her confidence seemed to evaporate under the pressure of intense questioning. Initially, she was adamant that Baldoni and his team used digital bots to coordinate a massive hate campaign against her. She spoke with total certainty, claiming she knew exactly what was happening behind the scenes. But when the questioning got specific, things started to fall apart. The lawyer asked for names, dates, and evidence of who she told about these alleged bots. Suddenly, the star who is usually so composed began to struggle for answers, unable to recall the specific details that would back up her massive claims of a conspiracy. When pressed for physical evidence, like text messages or emails that could prove her claims about the bots, Lively suggested she might have messaged friends about it. However, when asked to produce those documents, she couldn't offer anything concrete. This shift in her testimony was a major win for Baldoni's team. She went from being 100% sure that bots were used to ruin her life to saying she wasn't really sure anymore. It was a complete reversal that weakened her entire argument. Without concrete proof, her claims of a coordinated digital attack began to look more like personal perception rather than a legal reality, and the defense was ready to pounce. The questioning didn't stop there. The defense pushed her to identify specific individuals or actions responsible for the digital negativity she experienced. Lively described a general sense of media coverage and online attacks, but she remained frustratingly vague. Legal claims require specificity, not just broad impressions of being disliked. Baldoni's team continued to demand clarity, forcing her to admit that her beliefs were based more on her personal experience and how she felt during the release of the film. This highlighted a massive inconsistency in her case. She was suing over a coordinated attack that she couldn't actually prove was coordinated by anyone in particular. As the deposition continued, Lively tried to summarize the main accusations she faced, listing things like being called a bully or a mean girl. She mentioned that there were many other issues, but she struggled to list them in a clear, organized way. She also brought up the fact that she stays offline and avoids media to protect her children, using that as context for why she didn't have more specific information about the online discourse. But in the eyes of the law, avoiding the evidence doesn't make your claim any stronger. The defense maintained that if she wants to win a lawsuit for defamation, she has to be able to point to exactly what was said and why it was false. The atmosphere in the room turned cold as the lawyer explained that in a defamation case, the plaintiff has to be incredibly precise. You can't just say people were mean. You have to define the harm so the defense can actually respond to it. This pressure forced Lively to try and reframe her argument into what she called pillars of character attacks. She suggested that labels like bully and mean girl were just the tip of the iceberg, covering up a multitude of smaller stories and narratives. However, she still wouldn't name specific incidents, which played right into Baldoni's strategy of making her look like she was hiding behind vague generalities. There was a clear contrast in strategies happening in real time. Lively appeared to be staying intentionally vague to keep her options open for future claims, while Baldoni's legal team worked to pin her down to a fixed record. The attorney was described as calm and methodical, almost acting like an instructor rather than an aggressor. He made it clear that if she didn't identify specific statements and events now, they would be barred from the case later. This created a tense standoff where Lively seemed to be circling around her answers, avoiding the direct specifics that the legal system demands. It was a high-stakes game of cat and mouse with a massive fortune on the line. This is where the deposition gets truly uncomfortable for the actress. When asked if she had ever been described in the press as a bully or a mean girl before this project, she claimed she didn't recall that ever happening. It was a bold statement, but it was also a dangerous one. The defense was sitting on a mountain of historical material, including past articles, interviews, and crew commentary that suggested otherwise. By denying the existence of a long-standing narrative, she inadvertently opened the door for the defense to bring in every single negative headline from her entire career. It was a calculated risk that seemed to backfire the moment the records were pulled. One of the most damaging pieces of evidence brought up was an old interview from the Gossip Girl era. In it, Lively reportedly admitted that she had influenced how the entire cast viewed Penn Badgley before they even met him. She acknowledged that she shaped the group's perception of him, only to later realize her judgment was completely off. The defense is using this as a smoking gun to show that she has a history of influencing social dynamics on set. It directly contradicts her current image as a victim of a mean girl narrative, suggesting instead that she has been the one directing the narrative for a very long time. The deep dive into her past didn't stop with Penn Badgley. Baldoni's team also brought up the long-rumored tension between Lively and her co-star Leighton Meester. Media outlets at the time described a distant, icy working relationship and alleged ego clashes on set. Her own representatives back then even stated that the two actresses were not close off screen. By bringing these old wounds back into the light, Baldoni's lawyers are building a case that the Mean Girl label didn't start with him. It's been following her for over a decade. They are arguing that any damage to her reputation happened years ago and has nothing to do with the current dispute. Even more shocking were the accounts from behind-the-scenes crew members that surfaced during the discovery process. At least one production assistant from her past projects described her behavior as being like a bully toward the staff. These aren't just tabloid rumors anymore. They are being used as legal evidence to prove that a pre-existing perception existed in the public sphere. The defense doesn't even have to prove the claims are true. They just have to prove that people were saying them long before Baldoni ever entered the picture. If they can establish that, her claim for millions of dollars in damages could completely evaporate into thin air. The legal battle has also uncovered a key piece of evidence that explains why things got so toxic on the set of their recent movie. It's an email from a producer that suggests things were so bad that they were actually considering replacing the director entirely. At first glance, this sounds like Baldoni must have done something unforgivable. People assumed there was inappropriate behavior or a massive professional failure. But when the details of the email were actually examined, the reality turned out to be far less dramatic, though it revealed a massive breakdown in trust between the two leads that started much earlier than anyone realized. The huge controversy that almost got Baldoni fired was actually about a rehearsal recording. Apparently, Baldoni recorded a rehearsal with Lively and another actress without telling them at the very beginning. He only mentioned it after the fact, which made the actresses feel uncomfortable. While that might seem like a breach of etiquette, the context was crucial. This happened during the writer's strike, when they weren't allowed to write new dialogue. Baldoni's team argues he was just trying to capture improvised lines to use later so the production wouldn't stall. It was a creative workaround, but internally, it was treated like a declaration of war. The reaction to the recording incident was so extreme that it suggests sides had already been picked long before that day. The fact that replacing the director was discussed so early on shows that the environment was already poisoned. Baldoni was likely being viewed through a negative lens before he even did anything wrong. This supports his team's argument that the tension wasn't caused by his actions but by a pre-existing hostility within the production. It raises the question of whether he was ever given a fair shot, or if the narrative was already being built against him from day one by those who held the power. When you look at the big picture, it seems like Lively's legal strategy is based entirely on feelings and perceptions, while Baldoni's is based on documentation and history. Her team frames the situation as a coordinated digital attack, but they haven't produced the receipts to back it up. Meanwhile, Baldoni's team is using her own past words and internal emails to show a pattern of behavior and a pre-existing public persona. They are highlighting the contrast between her public image as a victim and the private documents that show a much more complicated reality on set. The narrative is shifting, and it's not moving in Lively's favor. The issue of the bots remains one of the most contentious parts of the case. While Lively claims she was targeted by a sophisticated digital campaign, legal experts note that proving a conspiracy is incredibly difficult. You need messages, payment records, or a clear trail of coordination. So far, none of that has appeared in the court filings. On the other hand, showing that a celebrity already has a controversial reputation is much easier. With years of articles and interviews at their disposal, Baldoni's team is having a much simpler time proving their side of the story. The scale of the negativity might have increased, but the origin seems to be much older. This legal battle is no longer just about a movie, it's a war over the very concept of reputation. Lively's team argues that even if some people didn't like her before, the intensity of the recent backlash was unprecedented and coordinated. They believe that perception itself can cause real, measurable damage, even if it's not tied to one single source. But Baldoni's team is holding firm on the idea that in a court of law, you need more than just bad vibes to win a case. They are forcing her to be accountable for every vague statement and every shifting memory, creating a level of scrutiny that she has rarely faced in her career. The public is now seeing a side of Hollywood that is usually hidden behind NDAs and PR teams. The emails, the depositions, and the old interviews are painting a picture of a production that was doomed from the start. Small incidents, like a rehearsal recording, were magnified into fireable offenses because trust had already been broken. It highlights how internal dynamics can shape public interpretations later on. Once these legal documents become public, they have more power to change the narrative than any press release ever could. The conflict has evolved into a layered sequence of events where every tiny detail is being used as a weapon. As more filings and discovery materials surface, the interpretation of who is the villain and who is the victim keeps shifting. It's becoming clear that there was no single turning point, but rather a slow buildup of tension and competing narratives. Baldoni's team is successfully using consistency and records to challenge Lively's credibility. Discrepancies in her testimony are being examined under a microscope, and every time she avoids a specific question, it adds more fuel to the fire. The overlap between media narratives and legal arguments has created a situation where the public is acting as a second jury, and the evidence is piling up fast. In the end, this case is about much more than a movie set disagreement or a few leaked emails. It is a high-stakes battle over who gets to control the narrative of a Hollywood superstar's life. As the legal proceedings continue, every single deposition and filing acts as a new chapter in a story that is quickly spiraling out of control. Whether Justin Baldoni can prove the reputation already existed, or Blake Lively can prove a coordinated attack remains to be seen. But one thing is certain, the mask has slipped, and the industry is watching closely to see what remains when the dust finally settles. The truth is rarely simple when the lawyers take the stage.